really like this mood light. Oh, you have presenter view to work. Awesome. Way. Yeah, where the minions hide. This is where the minions stand.
I'm not going to do the other.
No, you're not. Ever. Minions stand. Assuming we're waiting for video game.
It's on now.
Hey, where's the timer? Your presenter view doesn't have a timer? Gary's on?
Other than that.
Okay. I can't read that. Okay. All right.
Okay, why don't we get started? My name is Harry Regan, and I hear the microphone is on. I'm VP of Consulting Services for Securicon. This is Valerie Thomas. She's one of our lead engineers and security ninja. So what and not a minion. Yeah. So what we're going to talk about is disaster recovery programs. We're going to look at several different ones that were really done according to the book, and the book is really written by an organization called DRI, the Disaster Recovery Institute. It's actually DRII, it's a Disaster Recovery Institute International, but we leave the last I off because that's what we do. So we're going to talk about who we are, why we're involved in this, kind of the magic of mixing technology and people, which is always fun to do. We're going to talk about things that the Disaster Recovery Institute suggests that should be in a disaster recovery business continuity plan, and then look at 3 real-life examples, all of which followed the rules and had a fatal flaw. Talk about, lessons learned or scar tissue and recommendations out of that, and look at a 4th approach where an organization used the disaster to kind of, rethink some of their decisions, and then talk about conclusions and directions, recommendations. So, who are we? Securicon, this is the only ad I'm going to do. We're a professional services firm in the security space out of Alexandria, Virginia. Basically, we focus on critical infrastructure and regulated industries, finance, healthcare, utilities, things like that. We're about 14 years old, so we've developed a broad base of expertise in a variety of areas, including continuous operations planning and business continuity plans. And I've always had a fascination with what I call the BTA FFD syndrome, which is buttered toast always falls face down. Things always seem to go, for the worst. So let's talk about mixing technologies and human. Technology makes the world work. People make the world weird. And business continuity happens at the intersection of these 2 worlds, and throw in an emergency or 2 on top of that, and you get some real exciting results. So plans may be detailed, they may be logical, they may go into great detail, but people don't work that way. So there's a lot of dynamics that happen that that kind of change things. So, emergency scenarios can get complex, and you have to be flexible, and in some cases very, very flexible. So, if you think of policies and procedures, just how they work, how they're implemented, generally the theory is when you put a policy together that people are inclined to follow the rules. That may or may not be true. Just the example I like to use is a stop sign. How many people here always come to a full stop when they come to a stop sign? So we got a couple of hands. Odds are good that one or two of those people are correct and the rest are lying or mistaken. People aren't that consistent, and that's the world we have to live with. And that applies not only to the rank and file of your organization, that also applies to the members of your response team. They have their own issues, they have their own agendas, they have their own factors that'll affect their behavior. So one thing you won't know until a disaster actually happens, who the heck is going to show up in the first place? So things can get not quite as you anticipate. So throw in an emergency, basically you may have detailed plans, but all bets are off.
This is mine.
This is yours.
Mine. Okay, cool. It's mine. Okay.
So we kind of mixed up the order that we do the slides in this talk, so there's going to be a lot of, is this your slide? Kind of thing. Sorry in advance. This also is not my laptop. It's smaller, so I can't read it as well. So be patient with me.
So we may also be talking about the same slide at the same time, but that...
I'm closer to the mic, so we shall see. All right, so we're going to talk about the best of intentions today, and we all know about best intentions and roads and paving and whatnot. So we've got 3 plans that were implemented and may or may not have worked out the way that they were supposed to. And one of the things with that is, they tested these. Everything was tested. But they only tested pieces of these. And I think as technology people, we really start to fall into this area where when we talk about we tested this, that really means we tested to see if the failover worked. But we didn't test anything else that went along with the failover. So while you're going through these, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, that a lot of the failures that we're going to talk about weren't necessarily purely technology. A lot of it was the cross-section of technology and people. So technology only does so much without the people behind it. Anybody who does phishing campaigns knows all about how that works. If we got time, which I think we probably will, we'll look at the 4th case that Harry mentioned earlier. So all the things that you're supposed to do. If you read all of the regulations and the recommendations, this is the way to come up with your disaster recovery plan. Safety is supposed to be the #1 priority. We're supposed to put people first. So the next time you read your business continuity plan, just kind of keep in the back of your mind that that's probably not people-oriented, that's probably technology-oriented. Back to the same, did the failover work, did this work? Not about, hey, how do we keep people from getting hurt if this part of the building is inaccessible? What are we going to do if we need to get equipment from A to B? And a lot of these things came into play. That's not really a test case, so I'll save it if we have a little time toward the end. We'll just say if you rely on shipping as part of your disaster recovery plan, that's not always a good idea. Don't let them see you sweat, right? So the whole point of disaster recovery and business continuity is to keep things going. Even if it's just the public-facing presence so that everybody thinks everything is good, and you need to figure things out on the dark side, that's kind of the way it's played. Billing, right? That's still important. Most places, that's the highest priority. Billing is always first, because without billing, none of the other processes matter. So when you look at your business continuity plan, you might want to see which one of these systems is the top priority.
Payroll is #3 at best. 3rd priority.
Yeah, so back to that people thing, We don't really work too well if we don't get paid. Small little detail to remember. So back to the things that we should be doing. Contingencies, and we talk about these all the time. We do the whole training and awareness, and especially key staff, right? These are always the things that we talk about doing, that we should do, that look good on paper, but when it comes to actually putting them in place, these are usually really big gray areas or missing sections that are in the plan. So the other thing that I want to talk about really quick when it comes to training and implementation, and I think we've got a couple bullets kind of sprinkled throughout here, be sure that you're cross-training, because if Bob is supposed to do this specific thing and Bob is not there, you have a problem, especially if Bob is to take care of the billing system or the payroll system and nobody else knows what to do. Then you have a bigger problem, because now your people that you need to drive your technology are unhappy. So 3 quick tales today. It's always easier to learn from somebody else's failures than your own. It's also more entertaining. Some of these, they may sound a little antiquated. We'll talk about things like tape backups and shipping things back and forth. We've had folks in the audience come up to us before and say, nobody does that. Nobody ships tapes anymore. There are so many people that ship tapes. There are so many places that don't have backups to ship at all. So kind of keep in mind as we go through this that just because it's a little bit different than what we're used to today does not mean that every company has this in place already. So we'll talk about the other 9/11 issue, which I actually didn't know about until we started putting this presentation together. So that one's kind of cool. Back to the people. All it takes is people, which is great until you don't have any people. And then we'll talk about Y2K. There's some nostalgia for you. You guys haven't even started drinking yet. We're going to get nostalgic. You want this one?
Yeah. So all 3 of these are real case studies of clients I've had in different organizations. I should add that none of these are Securicon clients, so I can say rude things about them. So, when you think back to 9/11, one of the things, if you look at other things that were going on, there are 2 other big events going on when the 9/11 attack happened. Number 1 was the Code Red malware, explosion. But the other one was Hurricane Gabrielle. Hurricane Gabrielle was not a big deal. It was a Category 1 hurricane. Kind of came across central Florida as a tropical storm, became a hurricane in the Gulf, and then came back. So a client I had who was a manufacturing client had a data center outside of Orlando. During the tropical storm Gabrielle, the whole area got saturated, and then it came back. So they had a formal commercial disaster recovery plan with a large, reputable company whose name is 3 letters, but I won't say what they are. But the middle one is B, if that helps. So basically the deal was you have a contract, you specify, rules of engagement for how you're going to, identify, initiate a disaster, and then they will have an area reserved for you, the equipment you specify, and, once you trigger the disaster, you get your backup data there by whatever means you can, set up operations, run out of there until the disaster's over and migrate back. It's wonderful, except on 9/11, their backup recovery site was Sterling Forest, New York. They couldn't get the company to answer the phone, much less, help them, with their disaster, because everyone from New York was trying to, to get their services also. So two things you can find out from that is, number one, if the disaster site can't accommodate you, they give you this very polite, your request cannot be accommodated answer, but you do get your money back. So the good news is you're down hard, but you get your money back for the disaster recovery plan. So, they had a few other issues. So they kept their backup tapes. Yes, they were honest to God tapes on site. And the plan was they'd either FedEx them or they'd throw them in a van. They're in Central Florida. All you have to do is get on 95, drive north to the disaster recovery site and unload them. Unfortunately, they had nowhere to go. They had also arranged for specific equipment. They had some weird communications. I say weird, but let's just say legacy communications environment. They were an AS400 environment. So, while they had the equipment planned and the intent was they could just swap over, they had never really fully tested that. They had tested, parts of it, but, it was kind of iffy whether they could pull it off. So with really an untested plan, it was kind of iffy, from the beginning whether they could actually pull it off or not. But the good news is, again, with a third-party disaster recovery site, you can get your money back if you can't be accommodated. Yes, they flooded. The data center was flooded. They were down hard. But they learned stuff.
Okay, well, excellent. This one's mine. Awesome. I love this one. Okay, so we're going to learn some more stuff. Probably not exactly the same way. So, New England. It's rolling hills, it's very pretty and nice and scenic. If you've been to New England, you know that it's dotted with nice little cute historic towns, and there are cool things there like mills that they make into various things like restaurants and hotels, or in this case, a company that manufactures specialty equipment for the medical industry. Not sure why exactly they chose that location, but that must have been a good price when they bought it. But they didn't really think about, while this location is very picturesque and it was probably very cheap, it's very close to a lake. So when they were planning for their disaster recovery, they decided, we'll just do shelter in place. And for those of you who don't live in that kind of area, shelter in place is where you're at work, something bad happens, and you stay at work. They don't let you leave.
Let me add one little thing. The lake she mentioned was a man-made lake with 100-year-old earthen dam in front of it.
Details. They didn't say anything to the insurance company about that either. But that's a problem for later. We're not talking about insurance. So shelter in place works not even a little bit, because if there's a disaster and folks with families are told that they need to just stay there and do their job indefinitely, bad things happen. The other problem with shelter in place is what happens if the disaster hits when nobody's at work. Oops. Probably didn't think about that too much. And we all know about the 80-20 thing, right? Yeah. Yeah, probably not something that they foresaw. Yeah, probably not. So when they got the big storm, they decided, when they set the generators up, it's tied to the natural gas line. As long as there's gas, we have power. It's probably good. Probably don't need to do anything else there. They had divergent carriers with failover, so that's pretty impressive, actually, considering their location, that they were using two different ISPs. It didn't help them, but it looks really good. They set up a lot of remote access and things to really kind of run on their own, but they really still plan on everybody being there to feed and water all of those systems. So they always had a robust and tested remote access policy. So back to testing again. When we test remote access policies, do we test them with 50% of our workforce trying to connect? Do we test them with like 5 guys from IT that night? Usually we test them with 5 guys from IT, and then when 3/4 of the company needs to connect, nobody can connect. I don't understand what happened. We tested it. So similar issue here. But they missed a really key thing on the issue, on this whole thing. They decided that we will only train certain people to do certain things. So if Bob is to take care of this system and Bill is to take care of this system, that's all we're going to teach them. Which is great, except for when those people don't show up. So when that was brought up, it was, well, we'll do that later. We'll take care of that later. And we all know when later happens never. So in May of 2006, that area experienced severe flooding, like a lot of New England. All the telecommunications were out, though, so their divergent redundant connections that look so cool didn't help them. So when you don't have any connectivity, you don't have any remote access. It's kind of a problem. If nobody is at work when this happens and the roads are not usable, shelter in place doesn't really work when there's nobody in the place to shelter. So this building basically sat in the middle of this unattended for a few days. So it was kind of like the movie Home Alone, sort of, right, where the kid's home alone and he just kind of like lives it up. The system stayed up, so a lot of the things that they put in place on the technology side stayed up and were useful, but nobody was really there to kind of keep an eye on stuff. So even if something did happen, they wouldn't have a way to know. I love this one. So they also discovered that when they tested the plan, that they forgot to test how the voice networks, the VoIP phones, and the physical access control system, the thing that, locks and unlocks the doors, they forgot to test those to see how those would fail over, or if they would fail over. And they kind of forgot to move those to backup power. And because nobody was in place in the shelter to do that, there were no phones, no internet access, and when physical access control systems lose power, all the doors unlock. So all I did was sit there, but systems were up, home alone, with all the doors unlocked. So if you had a boat, you could probably get to the facility pretty easily. They didn't lose anything, which is really kind of interesting because if you had a boat and a little bit of motivation, you could have carried everything out. So it was a good plan, it was tested, but not all the way tested. And that's really where cross-training starts to come into play. If there's only one piece that we rely on one person to do, that's probably not the best way to do it. Was their plan successful? Well, everything still stayed up, right? So, sort of. They were out, not necessarily there a couple of days longer than a couple of days. But when you make your requirements loose, then, you kind of always overachieve at that point. All the automated processes ran, so the whole, don't let them see you sweat thing, as long as the client wasn't physically looking at their building, everything looked great on the internet-facing side. So from the client's perspective, everything is great unless you try to call. Little details. But nobody was in control for 3 days until they finally got the road serviceable enough to get somebody back into the building through the unlocked door.
So then, good old 1999. This particular company, I was that was grace and beauty there. So I was director of security for this company. Y2K, as you can remember, probably was a non-event. I was the second shift duty manager for the Washington D.C. area. So that meant I was on site at midnight on December 31st, 1999. We had 2 scans that we detected. One was coming from Tel Aviv, and we don't know who that was. The other was coming from Carnegie Mellon University, so we figured it was some grad student who had, less family and social life than we did. We determined that we could have, our duty cycle was from 15 December to 15 January. We discovered you really can have pizza for dinner for 30 days. And we also discovered that the hacker community, had better things to do than try to attack us at that point. But in preparation for that, we went through an exercise, with, across the whole company to prioritize, what applications were critical. We had, a multi-tier system. We tested and went through a lot of detail. Virtually all of 1999, I was rocketing back and forth between the backup data center and the primary data center, just testing different elements in the program. So we were ready. We had everything put together. So the primary data center is in suburban New York. It's about an hour north of New York City in Connecticut. Backup data center is in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. You can use Google to figure out who that is, though neither of those sites exist anymore. Long story. And, but they had taken, care to try to address all possible problems. So they had standing hotel reservations at hotels at both data center sites. They had gone through just nauseating detail in testing, different scenarios. It was a scenario-based plan. If this happens, we're going to do this. If this happens, we're going to do this. If this and this happen, then we have, a third set. So we had, last but not least, we had positions identified, kind of a role-based model to say if different things happened, then this group would work remotely and they'd be issued laptops and be sent off to this hoteling space, and very detailed plan. But, so we had monthly testing. The New York City staff was basically spread between 3 locations, 1 Liberty Plaza, Times Square, and Wall Street. Again, if you play with Google for a while, you can figure out who this is. And if staff had to be displaced, there were both hoteling locations and some people could be sent home, with laptops to do their job. Y2K came, and it was a non-event. Nothing happened. But that was the plan that was in place when 9/11 happened. So that was the plan that they executed against. 1 Liberty Plaza is across the street from the World Trade Center. So, if you think about the stock market for a second, that while the market opens at 9:30, the market staff actually is on site at 6 a.m. So all the market people are already there. They're already there. They're preparing for market open, and that's at both data centers. The first plane hit before market open, was about 8:15, 8:20, about that thing. So the decision was made, and this was made really at a governmental level, not to open the stock market. So they were actually ready to go, when the first plane hit, but they went on what's called a hold. They were waiting for things to happen. As it became apparent what was going on, the Liberty Plaza and Wall Street staff were evacuated to Times Square. At least that's what they thought they were going to do. Network was transferred to the backup site without incident. But, on one level, the plan was very successful. You had an almost seamless transition of systems from the primary to the backup. Turned out necessary because the market didn't open that day. In fact, the market was closed for 2 weeks after that. The market system staff was on site, in place, ready for normal operations, and the corporate staff, were all, this is 8 o'clock in the morning. A lot of them haven't even made it to work yet. The backup data center was in the D.C. area, and that was, as you recall, another 9/11 target site. There were staff injuries, and but no fatalities. So why were there injuries if you have that facility, that conditions set in place? And it's because of human nature. What do you do when the building across the street from you gets hit by a plane? You go out and look. So they had people from the One Liberty Plaza office go out and were watching, as things unfold. When the second plane hit and the South Tower collapsed. When the South Tower collapsed, that's when several people were hit by debris. No fatalities, fortunately, but that was a disaster. So the problem with the business continuity plan is there was no plan for losing Manhattan. Everything was compartmentalized to different locations. Things like, the evacuation plan, it assumed that the streets were navigable and the public transportation was available to get people out of the area. That wasn't available. Because of damage to the One Liberty Plaza building, there were severe and lasting, workforce issues, just displacement of people from those locations. And the other thing that, this was the Y2K plan. This was put together in late 1999, was finalized. It's now 2001. It's 2 years later. IT never ordered licenses for the VPN for the staff, but that's okay because they also didn't order laptops. So IT wasn't ready to bring in this influx of remote workers. And sometimes you get lucky. So, if you read anything about the World Trade Center, in the basement of the South Tower was the AT&T Switch Center for metropolitan New York. When the building collapsed, the Switch Center became unavailable, let's say. And they also took out the cell towers on the top of the building. But this company used MCI, and all the things were routed out of Connecticut. So, they weren't affected by that. So they had the network. They could still operate, but, Manhattan was destroyed.
This is mine?
This is
Oh,
yours.
this is mine, okay, cool. I can see it from over there.
All right, so instead of lessons learned and recommendations, I think scar tissue is a little bit more fitting, especially with some of these organizations. Recurring drills are important, and it's not just frequency, it's scale, as we've seen in a couple examples here. Backups, oh my gosh. So if you're doing incremental backups and your system goes out on the 23rd of the month, it's going to take a long time for you to get that system back up to where it was on the 22nd. So you might want to test that a little bit to see exactly how long that's going to take. If that's not an acceptable time, then you need to rethink the way that you're doing backups and HA pairs and all that great stuff. Because if you're not doing backups properly or at all, then you've got bigger problems. So we've also seen this happen with a handful of clients where they needed to do a bare metal restore, but they didn't necessarily know what they needed or have a really good list of everything that the software required. So you're going to need more than one thing. And actually, we had a little oops a while back. You really just don't plan for losing 2 drives out of a RAID 5 array. Like, how does that happen? Right? So even if you lose 2 drives out of your RAID 5, it's going to rebuild, but it's not going to be pretty. So, or quick. How long did that take? That took a long time to restore. Transactional systems, they really get upset if the handoff's not done properly. So I'm not going to talk about any vendors here. Oracle. Those systems get really upset if you get that mixed up. And then you get really weird things in the database, and we all know what happens when we get corruption in the database. Lots of people have very bad days. If you're using a third-party backup site, and it's not something that you've looked into really testing, like live testing, do that and check your service contract with them, because a lot of times they may not have the actual equipment that you need. And that comes down to like things like cables and RAID controllers. And if you have something with, God forbid, SCSI drives, and you didn't tell them that, then you've got a bigger problem. Yes, we have clients that use SCSI drives, but that's another story. So, what do we do about all this? And I think that we really need to look at the disasters that you're potentially facing, not just your organization, but what about your disaster recovery sites? So, for those of you who don't know, I actually started my career in the defense industry. So I used to be a Fed, but I'm better now, a lot better now. I used to work for the Defense Information Systems Agency, so that's kind of like the ISP of DoD, right? Backhaul, long-haul comms, and satellites and good stuff like that. They didn't really think about stuff like disaster recovery sites and disasters when they did a lot of their planning. So one of their sites for backup was Slidell, Louisiana. Let's put the backup site below sea level. What could possibly go wrong? So when Katrina hit and we were trying to get things coordinated between, gosh, this dates it, JTF-GNO up at DISA headquarters, and what the folks needed at Slidell, we needed to get equipment to them, mostly not special equipment. Good luck finding a carrier that's going to deliver that for you. So you call FedEx, and they're like, yeah, UPS is still open. You might want to check with them. We're not going to deliver there. So if you depend on that, you might want to have another process in place just in case something like that happens. Lots of other really interesting lessons out of Hurricane Katrina, but we'll leave it at that for now. We won't go into what you can't spell without DISA. They're not a client. It's cool.
Especially not now.
Not now. Oh, well. Let's see. We already talked about this.
Our side doesn't.
Yes. And back to maintaining equipment at the DR site. So if you have it in your contract and you know they have the equipment and you upgrade at your primary site, how many of you actually remember to make sure that the DR site upgraded? If you didn't do any kind of real live rollover testing, then you're not going to know. And what happens is the old hardware can't run the new software, which you don't know until nothing can run the new software, and then you have a bigger problem. So I think we already drilled this into the ground. Cross-training is good. We need to make sure that we have backups for the people, not just the technology. And because you just don't know who's going to show up or not show up until a disaster comes. And that looks like your slide. Yeah.
So I mentioned earlier, having granular plans, and what that really means is really two things. One is going to the level of detail that you think you'd need to address for a known disaster. Have categories of disasters defined in advance, and then a detailed approach on how you would do it. But things never really happen like you expect them to, so expect the half disaster. You know, you didn't lose the data center, you lost part of the data center. Or, you know, it's, you know, the network, you know, you have a regional network outage, not a total network outage. So there's, you know, there's things that can make your life, you know, tricky if you don't go into enough detail. And in any disaster, you know, people are a variable. So, you know, you can have these great plans that say, you know, these 5 people are going to, you know, serve these roles in a disaster recovery. You know, and a lot of plans have like primary, secondary, and tertiary. But let's take a case of like a pandemic, you know, or something like that. None of them may be available. So, you know, you've got to be able to plan for that and you know, how you address it.
That also gets really important when you're working in a classified environment, because if 3 people know the combination to the classified safe and they're not there, you've got a big problem. Not that I would know, but yeah.
So to the extent possible, compartmentalize is the message there. You know, it's have the situational plan, but have it, you know, done to a level where you can take pieces of the plan. And it's always good to have what I call an OCISD strategy, which is the, oh crap, it's something new. You know, you can sit down and think about all these different possibilities, but nature's interesting. It can throw things at you. No, by the way, usually I don't use the word, you know, crud or crap in the OCISD, but you can fill in the piece. But let's talk about an alternative. There was another client. This is a different 9/11 story. It was a cosmetic company, headquartered in New York. They have 2 R&D facilities. One's in central New Jersey. One's in Nice, France. Yes, the French Riviera. So they had planned to consolidate all the researchers into the New Jersey facility, and the company I was working for at the time was helping them build out and define the new R&D center. By the way, cosmetic companies are one of the biggest consumers of security technology on the planet, because most of what they have are considered trade secrets. So, you know, this particular R&D facility had, you know, access control system, you know, physical access control system. They had video surveillance. They had biometrics in different areas. It was a sophisticated operation and very typical of that industry. So when 9/11 happened, you know, they made a corporate decision that they would take the corporate office and, you know, forget about this consolidation of the researchers, move all the corporate people down to the facility in New Jersey. And, you know, that was a good example of being able to capitalize on a disaster to basically lessen your risk profile. But it's always bothered me. It's always worried me that the researchers in the French Riviera who were told they were moving to New Jersey, they are the ones who perpetrated 9/11. You've heard it here first. So, if you take nothing else from this, test, refine, repeat. Be very flexible. Things will not happen like you expect them to happen. And when it does happen, you know, be ready to learn, you know, from the pieces that you didn't plan for. And I love quotes from George Patton because he said some terrific things, and the one that applies here is when the first shot is fired, battle plans go out the window. So it won't happen like you think it'll happen. Thank you. Yeah, so questions, comments, obscenities. Gingerly. So the idea is to be flexible. You know, it's be willing to deviate from the plan or go through a much more intense planning program and have, you know, contingencies laid out. Most DR plans and BCP plans that I've seen in 30 years of working with these really